artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, this is episode 221. We are talking with Markus Anderljung, who is Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for the Governance of AI in the UK. He aims to produce rigorous recommendations for governments and AI companies. His research focuses on frontier AI regulation, responsible cutting-edge development, national security implications of AI, and compute governance. He is an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security and a member of the OECD AI Policy Observatory's expert group on AI futures. He was previously seconded to the UK Cabinet Office as a senior policy specialist. Last week, we talked about the work of the Center, otherwise known as GovAI, and definitions of artificial general intelligence insofar as they affect governance, and how monitoring and verification might specifically work. So let's get back to the interview with Markus Anderljung. Now, also to take a cue from the Cold War, we had teams of UN inspectors going into factories of one kind or another and weapons facilities to check that they had what they said they had there. And you were starting to talk about equivalents of that where, as science fictional as it sounds, it is your job and our job to think a little bit further ahead. One can imagine there being something in data centers that does not belong to the data center owner, but they're required to put there to monitor what goes on in some way. Now, this is going to horrify anyone who does those kind of computations and uses the cloud, and anyone who provides a cloud. Is going to sound like the most police state kind of language that you can imagine. But do you think it's going to end up there eventually for verifying advanced AI?
Yeah, I think it might. And I think we should be thinking now about what that kind of situation might look like. And so there's a few different routes here. One route might be via this route, but it seems very plausible to me that these systems, as they become more and more capable, they are going to be systems that are of sort of national security concern. And so the national security apparatus in the US and in other jurisdictions will have an interest in these systems. And you might have an interest in that for different kinds of reasons. One thing that you could imagine is this kind of concern of, okay, maybe there's some kind of rogue actor or some kind of smaller actor or terrorist groups or something like this being able to train systems and deploy systems that can do certain kinds of things. That's sort of one class of sort of scenarios that you might think about. And what the kind of things that might end up happening there is you might be interested in, okay, well, we now want to have a little bit of a sense of sort of where the computational power sits. And so proposals that I think might actually make sense even at the moment is sort of making sure that there's some sort of accounting of sort of where the most powerful chips in the world are going. Currently, this is sort of on the order of maybe, it's now edging up towards maybe 1 million of sort of the most powerful chips being produced a year, and having a sense of sort of where they are. Currently, there's basically no real accounting of this. But you can imagine that that's something that you might need to do over time, at least for us to get a sense of where are the sort of large agglomerations of these chips. And in the US, there's also been a decent amount of reporting and interest in these chips making their way to China and to PLA and other kinds of similar actors, even though the US has put in place these concerns. So these chips are managing to sort of be smuggled. And so there's a number of things that you could do to try to do this kind of accounting. You could just keep a registry of where things are. You could try to find ways then to sort of keep that registry kind of up to date. And there's a bunch of methods you can use here that we use for sort of other material of sort of national security kind of concern. You could also imagine that maybe if you're looking at sort of very large agglomerations, you could also imagine that maybe you would have some physical inspection regime. There's also some kind of things that people have been talking about of maybe one idea that I think could be interesting, you try to sometimes send a ping to the GPU, and then you see how long it takes that ping to come back. And that might give you some evidence of sort of it's not going to be great, but it's going to maybe gives you enough ability to tell where the GPU is to be able to verify or at least check a little bit the log that you might have of sort of what actors are supposed to be owning these chips at the moment. So I think there's going to be some things along those lines. Hopefully, these kinds of things we can also do in sort of more privacy-preserving ways over time. And so, yeah, I was mentioning this thing of maybe you can tell the difference between training and inference. If that's the case, then if you're intervening, maybe all you need to do is you need to look at the training. And then over time, you could imagine that we might be able to develop even more privacy-preserving ways of sort of doing these kinds of checks. That we might hope that we'd be able to do that. And then if we look sort of further afield, it might also be the case that nation states have an interest in what other nation states are doing. And so you could imagine that like the Chinese government, for example, might be interested in knowing, okay, well, GPT-7 is being trained or GPT-6 or something like this is being trained. And we're worried that this system might have certain features that could be worrying. Maybe we're worried about the system not being sort of easy enough to align or make sure that it sort of acts in accordance with sort of the user's intentions and whatnot. If that's the case, you might imagine that you'll want some kind of verification regime that not just aimed at sort of these sort of smaller players, but also in this sort of dynamic that two players are a little bit more on sort of equal footing. And I think that is also something where we could use some of these similar-ish tools. And so you could have these kinds of accounting regimes of sort of where chips are. There are other things that like you could use to potentially get a sense of, okay, well, how much does it seem like this actor has the amount of computational resources that they say they do? And so an example of a thing that you might do is you might send a little task to a data center that you can only do in a certain small period of time if you have enough chips or if you have as many chips as you say you have. And that might then be a way of checking, are the chips where you said they were? And a lot of these things that I'm mentioning here, a lot of them are sort of somewhat speculative or sort of haven't been fully bottomed out. But I think there are a lot of potential technical solutions here that could sort of make verification a little bit easier than you otherwise might have thought. And maybe even in some cases, you might not need as many. Yeah, in the nuclear case, you end up having a lot of individual humans walking around various sites where they think there might be some suspicious activity, and they look around with Geiger meters and whatnot. And I could imagine that you might need to do some of that if you have this kind of scenario where maybe further afield there's some kind of agreement between the US and China, for example, on what kind of training runs are allowed or not. But I can imagine that a decent amount of it could be done in a sort of a little bit less intrusive way as well.
Wow. And the immediate thought I have is that if China invades Taiwan, then it will take over the factories of TSMC, and then the whole question of stopping it from getting advanced chips becomes moot.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a very, very interesting question. Yeah, people have different views on this. Some people have the view that, oh no, at least those factories will be destroyed in any situation like that. I don't know how likely that is, but that seems quite plausible to me. But maybe the thing that like you can't really avoid in that kind of situation going to being made available to Chinese officials would be a lot of the talent that maybe would find it difficult to sort of make it out in time.
Right. And I really appreciated the ingenuity of some of the ideas there, like sending advanced compute to chips to check that they're where they were supposed to be, because you could have it mine cryptocurrency and then pay for the effort at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that brings up the fact that software is infinitely malleable in a way that hardware and things like uranium separation plants are not. So like the definition of computer science, the essence of computer science is coming up with inventive ways of solving problems, like, for instance, splitting one big problem into thousands of little ones and doing parallel processing, which is something you just can't do with a nuclear bomb. So is there a significant danger of bad actors in this space gaming any performance-based regulation through one out-of-the-box approach after another, all of which fly under the radar of the numerical limits?
Yeah, I think the short answer there. But I think, so examples of the kinds of things that you might be worried about. Sometimes the thing that people talk about is being able to do sort of distributed training. So you try to be able to train a system using lots of different chips that are maybe geographically distributed. And maybe another thing that you might be concerned about is instead of using the sort of latest and greatest H100 chips, what if you use some sort of older generation systems, but you just have more of them? And so I think these are things to be concerned about and things to sort of focus on. In short, I think for the most part, the answer is the difference there is primarily just going to be a matter of cost. But the question is, how much bigger is the cost and how much more difficult is it to do these kinds of things? So the sort of academic papers that we have at the moment on decentralized training or distributed training that goes across a geographically split chips, I don't know if there are any that is training models that are bigger than maybe 1 billion parameters. That's sort of at least 2 orders of magnitude, sort of smaller than some of the big ones or sort of some of the most capable systems. Maybe that will change over time, but I think it does suggest that there is some additional difficulty here. And then similarly, sort of if you use these sort of less powerful chips, a lot of the challenge in training these systems is just in the how do you orchestrate these currently sort of in the tens of thousands, soon it'll be the hundreds of thousands of chips. How do you orchestrate them so that they can all jointly help out in training this model over the course of a couple of months? And that is a tremendous technical challenge. And that challenge will be greater and harder if you sort of have different kinds of chips and chips that sort of are sort of less capable, because then you'll need to sort of send more packets of data and whatnot. And so I think, in short, this is a kind of dynamic that you'll have to look out for. And I think regulators and also technical researchers, I think they just need to think about these questions and see what kind of implications this has for any kinds of sort of governance regimes that are put in place for sort of these sort of really high compute systems. And if we do that, then I hope that these kinds of problems are manageable. But I guess we'll see.
So you wrote in a paper that several jurisdictions are starting to regulate frontier AIs, and the requirements could be formulated as high-level principles. Now, I'm interested in the principles. What's the lineage of those principles? They connote that they are universal, that they're timeless, that they make ethical and moral sense. And formal efforts to create such principles, not counting, say, Isaac Asimov, go back at least to the Asilomar conference. And yet there wasn't a lot of reuse. Like, no one refers to those, despite the fact that I thought they were really good work. Are these efforts of defining principles starting to converge? Could we eventually end up on one set that people could agree, yes, that's what we want to follow. We don't have to keep reinventing this?
Yeah, so part of what I think here is sometimes the principles isn't where all the work is. Maybe, I think quite often, a lot of the work is about how do you turn those principles into practice. And so a lot of what we've been thinking about when we've been thinking about regulation is sort of maybe the kinds of regulation that we'll need and sort of what's people in thinking about regulation more broadly in a lot of other domains. Sometimes they call it principles-based regulation. Sometimes they call it goal-based or outcomes-based regulation, where the thing that you try to do here is, as a regulator or as a government, instead of trying to prescribe really quite specific rules or really quite specific actions that you want sort of a regulated entity or a company to take, what you try to do instead is you try to set some kind of high-level principle that they need to meet or sort of uphold or sort of act in accordance with. And then you don't give a tremendous amount of detail of how to do that. And then over time, the thing that you do is sort of as you learn more about the space, then you can start putting in place, making this a little bit clearer. Maybe you can start putting out guidance where you say, okay, well, we think that if you follow these more specific steps, we think that you've probably met this principle. But we will presume that that's the case, but it won't always be the case. And sometimes we will look at what you've done and we will say, no, you actually didn't meet the principle, and you should have done a better job at getting a sense of whether the guidance actually applied in the particular context that you were a part of. And so my guess is that in the AI space, at least for certain kinds of requirements, at least for the ones that I care the most about, these kinds of requirements of sort of just don't impose an acceptable risk on society. My guess is that some of that, at least initially, it will have to be at kind of that level of generality. That's the principle that you need to adhere to. And then what I want is I want a competent regulator and I want other actors and third parties and whatnot to be a part of assessing how companies go about turning those principles into practice to make sure that they're sort of doing so in a public interest way. And then over time, we'll learn more and we'll get a better sense of, okay, well, if you trained your system that way, then this is going to cause some kind of issues, or we'll learn that sort of, or a thing that seems very plausible to me, that sort of over time, these kinds of like reinforcement learning from human feedback type techniques that we've used in the past, they won't really hold up as systems keep getting more capable, and we'll need to use other techniques. And that kind of thing, I think you can sort of add on over time. Maybe to get a little bit more specific on sort of what kinds of principles I think are the most likely to sort of be put into regulation. I think one good place to start will be these there's these frontier AI safety commitments that 16 companies signed up to in Seoul in May. And those, I'll just summarize them at a very, very high level. And so they say things like, okay, well, you should explicitly state under what conditions you think that you will be posing unacceptable risk on society. Secondly, you should do lots of evaluations and assessing whether you think that you're hitting those kinds of thresholds. And then you should bring in third parties in sort of assessing whether, like looking at your assessments and whatnot, and maybe doing their own assessments. And then you should also predefine what you intend to do to keep the risk below these kinds of thresholds that you defined. And so that seems to me like that's a place to start. And then we're going to need to build on that over time. And we're going to need to have regulators and third parties and whatnot be a part of saying, okay, well, you set some thresholds, but do these actually make sense?
And you're talking there about the, I think, more practical street level guidelines, which we clearly need. And I'm just wondering about high level principles, sort of commandments, if you will, that people might feel in general more reassured if they knew that there was some commitment to following them. So Silomar had things like don't do recursive self-improvement or self-replicating systems, and 21 other things that were mostly, I thought, incontestable with respect to risk mitigation that really anyone could read and understand. Is that largely unnecessary then, or might it have some value as a public relations exercise?
Value. Yeah, I think that I actually would be very excited about someone doing. Maybe someone listening could do this, is go back and look at those Silomar principles and compare them to where we are today. The ones that you just mentioned, it doesn't seem to me that those will be adhered to. And so, currently a lot of what people are thinking about in terms of sort of how AI systems will become more and more capable is over time figuring out how AI systems could be replace or sort of automate a lot of the work that AI researchers are currently doing. And similarly, people are trying to understand how do we build AI agents that could take sort of longer range tasks or sort of actions on behalf of their users. And I could imagine that maybe that goes against other principles and that were sort of agreed to at Silomar. So I think that could be very, very interesting and could be really quite useful. And I expect that it could be useful for some of these kinds of principles to be agreed to. I think currently, and especially I would want that to happen at sort of an international level. Currently, we're sort of starting to see movements along these lines via these AI safety summits that have been happening, but currently we haven't really gotten all that far. And so where we've gotten to at the moment is, in Seoul, again in May, the governments that were there, they agreed to, okay, well, we will by the next summit, which is in Paris in February next year, we will agree to some sort of red lines or whatnot. We're going to agree to some systems or some kind of situations in which we think that AI systems, the risk that they pose, is just not acceptable, the risk that they pose. And we'll see what sort of specifics come out of that, but maybe that could take some of this kind of shape. And I think that could be really, really quite useful. And I would enjoy, especially these kinds of, maybe one way to put it is sort of principles that are quite concrete. They sort of point to a specific kind of system or a specific kind of action that a system might take. Maybe another example of this of a principle that is starting to form that I feel positive about is sort of there's now a decent number of countries that are coming out and saying we will not have AI systems make decisions about whether to launch a nuclear weapon. That seems very good to me. And I would want all nuclear powers to sort of agree to something like that. We have statements along these lines in both the US and in the UK. And I would want that to sort of spread to more actors as well.
It seems that as in many cases, the issue is not so much what are the answers, but who's asking the questions at these meetings. Our time is going to be up soon. So the last hard question I want to ask is, we shouldn't really expect industry to come up with safety frameworks any more than we should expect, like the automobile industry to have come up with its safety standards. They didn't even want to do seat belts until the issue was forced by a third party. So we ended up with the Department of Transportation, and we have things like the British Standards Institute and so forth, which seem to do that job reasonably well. What do you see happening with respect to that role for AI? Do you think it's going to go in the direction of some kind of universally agreed standards institute that governs this?
Yeah, so one thing I'd say is just AI is just incredibly broad. Actually, a thing that I think is sort of sometimes it's just really quite unhelpful to, we are the Center for AI Governance, but most of the work that we do is focused on a pretty small sliver of AI. It's primarily focused on these sort of most capable systems that usually are quite general purpose, or the system that otherwise we think might pose the sort of greatest risks. And so if we focus specifically on these sort of general purpose, sort of the most powerful systems, what we're seeing there, I guess in the EU, we'll have the AI office, which is now set up, and we'll have powers over these systems. It will be sort of next year that they'll just sort of officially be able to properly intervene on these kinds of systems. But I think that the fact that they'll get those powers already is kind of changing the dynamic a bit. In the UK, it's unclear what institution would be responsible for this under sort of regulation that sort of has been sort of announced will be introduced at some point. Maybe it will be the AI Safety Institute that the UK set up last year that sort of has focused a lot into doing sort of AI safety research and whatnot and done a good job at it. And then in the US, that's a very hard question. And
NIST?
So NIST, I think, might be the body that produces a lot of the relevant standards and guidance, and then probably will be enforced somewhere else. Just because NIST, at the moment, to my knowledge, it doesn't enforce any regulation. But so maybe currently what it looks like, maybe it would be in the Department of Commerce, or sometimes people talk about the Department of Energy being responsible for these kinds of things. And probably it would be some kind of new unit set up within these organizations. But it's all a bit unclear, and we'll sort of see when Congress, I expect at some point Congress will come to agreement that something needs to be done in this space, but very unclear to me when that will end up happening. And then globally speaking, and sort of, will there be some kind of international harmonization? I don't really know what that will end up looking like in practice, but I think there will be, at least for these general purpose systems, I think there will be pretty strong pressures towards trying to have some kind of harmonization of requirements imposed, both because these companies, they'll really, really want to just be able to do one thing globally. They'll try to push for that. And then I think also countries will also feel a little bit of this pressure because they'll have this sense of sort of AI is a part of geopolitical competition and they want to do well in AI. And so therefore, you might be more comfortable taking steps if you think that other countries are also taking steps to sort of increase the sort of safety or otherwise imposing requirements on development of these systems. And so I think there's sort of some reasons for hope that you might have things on the international level, but it's a lot more unclear what that will look like in practice. And it seems like a bit of a further way to go.
And thank you for doing all this. And thank you also for bringing such an air of optimism to it. To wrap up here, I wonder if you could tell us, what are your current projects, biggest, most interesting challenges, most challenging interests, and where should people go to find out more about what you and GovAI are doing, and what would you like them to know?
Yeah, thank you for asking so many interesting questions. Yeah, I think some of the main things where I'm spending a lot of my time on at the moment, maybe it's three big buckets. One bucket is on the research side. One big bucket is sort of what we've been talking about a lot here is, usually what I will call it is sort of frontier regulation. So what kind of regulation do we need to impose on sort of the most powerful systems? Another thing that we're sort of spending more and more energy on is these frontier AI safety frameworks, or frontier AI safety commitments that I mentioned. So these commitments that were made in Seoul, and then now you have 16 companies that are supposed to produce frameworks that sort of adhere to these principles that I mentioned. And they need to produce these frameworks by Paris. So Paris in February 2015. And so one thing we're trying to do is we're trying to do research and thinking about what do actually good frameworks like this look like. And so maybe one way to motivate people to do work on this is currently we have 4 companies that have put out policies like this. So they'll say, if our system can do X, we think that wouldn't be okay to put out there in the world. This is quite remarkable that the companies have produced these kinds of documents. And on the other hand, I feel like the rest of the world and sort of the public and academics and whatnot, I feel like aren't engaging very much with these documents. And I would really, really want to see more of that, because the only way that these documents will actually be good and will actually be helpful is if we sort of, as a greater society, hold these companies accountable to make sure that these policies sort of promote the public interest. And so I want to see more of that. We're doing some research on those kinds of questions. And then maybe more of another topic that sort of I'm trying to spend some more time on, but mainly at GovAI, it's a person called Alan Chan who's spending a lot of time on this, is thinking about sort of, we call it agent governance. So if we start into sort of developing AI systems to sort of take more long-range tasks on the user's behalf, which is what a lot of companies are currently trying to build, what kinds of governance interventions might you need there? And so you might need to do things like, maybe we need to build particular infrastructure on the internet for these AI systems. And so maybe one thing that you could imagine is you don't want these AI systems to be engaging with the internet like a human. Instead, you want them to sort of have specific APIs that they use. And maybe that will be helpful both for these systems to be behaving more, be able to sort of more efficiently engage with a service or a website, but also it gives us a little bit more of a sense of, okay, where are all the AI systems taking actions in the world? Okay, we look at these APIs and we see what's happening. And so that sort of general idea of sort of building visibility into sort of the actions of AI agents, I think might end up being important. We have a paper called Visibility into AI Agents. That could be a good place to start. There might be other things to do in this space as well. There's big questions about liability for what an AI agent does. That will end up being really important, I think, going forward. So those are some of the things that we're sort of focused on. But other parts of AI are thinking about international governance and economic impacts of AI and a whole host of things. If you want to learn more about us, I think the first thing to do is just to go to governance.ai, which is our website. Gov.ai is the website of the government of Antigua. And so that's not where you want to go. And then I don't know if I have other good answers. Other things you could do is you could go to my website. So that's just myname.com, markusanderljung.com. And I don't know if I have other really good suggestions.
But those are plenty good enough and interesting to our listeners there.
Thanks.
So thank you for taking time away from such a important and valuable agenda to spend it helping us understand what that's all about. And I hope to hear more about how that's proceeding in the months and years to come. So Markus Anderljung, thank you very much for coming on AI and You.
Thank you so much, Peter.
That's the end of the interview. Personally, I think that some kind of cyberspace police force is in our future, which is to say that the questions of compliance will be settled by verification actions that are necessarily conducted by virtual agents or by people patrolling through computer systems virtually. Think cyberpunk. This is where my imagination gets away from me and I start imagining a sort of Judge Dredd character stalking through data centers in cyberspace, meting out instant justice on misaligned systems that have non-compliant AI. Hollywood, call me. Okay, lots of ideas. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, researchers claim that GPT-4 has passed the Turing test. This is something that those of us in the field have been implicitly assuming ever since it came out, so it is something of an anticlimax to see it proven, but at least someone's gone to the trouble of doing that. The paper by Cameron Jones and Benjamin Bergen of the Department of Cognitive Science at UC San Diego, published on archive.org, says that they evaluated 3 systems: GPT-4, GPT 3.5, and ELIZA. Yes, that ELIZA, in a controlled Turing test. We've discussed the Turing test countless times on this show. Participants had 5-minute conversations with those agents and humans, and then decided whether or not they were talking to a human. Unsurprisingly, ELIZA only scored 22%, which still seems high when you think about it, and GPT 3.5 scored 50%, but GPT-4 scored 54%. Turing had said anything better than 30% would count as a pass, but these researchers justified a threshold of 50% through some compelling logic. Now, humans were graded as being human 67% of the time, which is obviously and perhaps thankfully better than GPT-4, but it's not 100%. And the researchers say that this likely reflects changing assumptions about the quality of AI systems and is similar to other recent estimates. They conclude that, quote, the results have implications for debates around machine intelligence and, more urgently, suggest that deception by current AI systems may go undetected, end quote. Next week, my guest will be Craig Kaplan, researcher into safe and ethical AGI and superintelligent systems. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.